The Centre for Livable Cities was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources in 2008, with the aim of distilling, creating, and sharing knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC Lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. Today we have with us Mr. Mark Harris and Mr. Amit Pathare from Engie. Mr. Harris is Business Unit Lead for the Services Division of Engie UK and Ireland. He has spent the last 15 years in business development and operational delivery within the local government and utility services outsourcing sector. Currently, he is managing the sector within the Engie UK business that provides total facilities management and project delivery services for power stations and corporate estates. Mr. Pathare is Group Director of New Solutions and Director for the Key Program for Cities in Engie. He has been an energy and utilities sector executive for the last 20 years and has held management positions within the Engie Group over the last 9 years. He's an advocate for steering Engie's activities into new geographies, technologies, and business domains. So the format for today is that Mr. Pathare will speak first, and he will set the context on some of the global trends that Engie is seeing in cities and in the outsourcing sector. And he will be followed by Mr. Harris, who will go into the nuts and bolts of Engie's contracting model in UK cities. And then we will end off with a Q&A session, which will be moderated by Mr. Yip Hon Weng, who is Senior Director of Policy and Planning with the Municipal Services Office within the Ministry of National Development. So without further ado, I will hand the time over to Mr. Pathare.
Let me just start by introducing the company itself. So you may have heard of the Suez Canal, right? Okay, well, there you go. So Engie is a company that has really started out in many diverse forms. One of these forms was indeed as the financer and the builder, the constructor of the Suez Canal, from which we get our name, one part of our name at least. And so that was one of the biggest engineering projects of the 19th century. Then gradually over the 20th century, we started merging with several different entities from France. So there's GDF, or Gaz de France, which is the French gas utility. We had several Belgian utilities as well, like Electrobel, that slowly started adding to the family. And then gradually, the company started expanding in Europe as well as beyond Europe. So now, if you see where Engie stands today. So it's pretty much a global company. So when GDF and Suez merged in 2008, it was called GDF Suez. And last year, we rebranded to say Engie. Engie being very close to the word energy. So we are present across more than 70 countries, and we are present in several different domains, which start with energy, but which go beyond energy. For instance, in the field of energy, we have power generation, over 100 gigawatts or 100,000 megawatts of power generation capacity spread across different technologies. So including the usual historical thermal technologies, but also all forms of renewable. And I mean, in renewable, it's all different sub-technologies of solar, wind, onshore and offshore, biomass, geothermal. So we are pretty much a technologically diversified company. We are pretty much a geographically diversified company as well. And what I'll come to eventually is we are pretty much business model diversified as well. So that's on the power side. On the gas side as well, we cover all gas activities, starting from exploration and production all the way towards LNG and gas sales. The E&P arm of gas, we have recently announced a sale to a different company. So we are gradually exiting the exploration and production business. We are exiting other carbon-intensive businesses as well, including coal and including some of the dirtiest forms of power generation. So gradually, Engie is moving towards cleaner forms. Singapore is a microcosm of Engie in its totality, because our businesses in Singapore are also, well, I may say Engie is a well-kept secret in Singapore. We own different businesses, including a stake in Senoko, a huge services business with over 1,500 people. We have LNG businesses. We have an Engie R&D lab, which develops very interesting pilots across different renewable technologies and energy storage. And we have Engie Solar, which used to be called as Solar Direct. So there is a whole bunch of services there. Now we are increasingly moving into district cooling, into energy efficiency, and what I will come to, our business in cities. So what is propelling this change from carbon-intensive forms of business towards the more renewable forms? It's three main drivers, what we call as the 3Ds: decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization. So decarbonization is indeed the move from carbon-intensive towards more renewable technologies. Decentralization means that you will no longer have a preponderance of large centralized power plants or large gas installations. You effectively operate in a more distributed form. So a lot of the renewable technologies are deployed in more decentralized fashion, so closer to the customer. And digitalization is also a means towards more and more digital solutions, both as part of our historical legacy businesses, but also increasingly in the new businesses that Engie brings. So collectively, it can be said that Engie is an architect of the energy transition. In fact, we go even beyond the transition. We like to refer it to it as an energy revolution, and that's precisely what we are headed in. So I've already mentioned this slide. So it's power production, global infrastructures, and customer solutions. And now in our customer solutions, okay, there's different kinds of solutions. So you may have heard of the moniker B2C, that's business solutions for consumers. You may have heard of B2B, that's business solutions for businesses. And now there's an added form, which is B2T, that's business solutions for cities and territories. So what we've realized is that in addition to selling to businesses and to individual consumers, we also inhabit very complex ecosystems with multiple stakeholders, with governments, which comprise local real estate developers, which comprise local businesses. And when you look at an ecosystem like a city, or like a military base, or like an island, what you're dealing with is multiple kinds of solutions. And therefore, to manage this complex ecosystem, we also geared our business in this form towards what is B2T, business solutions for cities and territories, to cater to very complex ecosystems. And that's the part of the company that I represent. So I've been with the group for nearly 9 years, and I have lived the energy transition myself. So joining the group when we dealt with mainly large centralized power generation units, and now living this move increasingly towards renewables, towards distributed energy, towards green mobility, like electric vehicles, natural gas vehicles, and all of these new businesses that Engie has. And recently, over the last year and a half, as the head of the cities program. And I'll explain a little bit about that. Why cities? Well, cities because the world is getting increasingly urbanized. And cities comprise just 2% of the world area, but they comprise 50%, and now increasingly in the next 15 to 20 years, they will end up having anywhere between 60 and 70% of the world's population. They have 75% plus of the world's energy consumption and 80% of the world's greenhouse gases. So if you want to tackle climate change, if you want to tackle sustainability, then cities or urban areas are the best way to begin. So if you speak from the perspective of a city, what helps create a better city? Now, a city may have different kinds of challenges. A city has an energy challenge, it has a mobility challenge, it has a challenge on security, on public lighting, etc. But you can't see these challenges as isolated domains. What you want to do is see these challenges collectively in an integrated fashion. And to manage these challenges in an integrated fashion requires two levers. A, the lever of connectivity, and B, the lever of smart governance. So that's something that we do. So if you look at it from the perspective of a citizen, a perspective of an end user or a customer of the city, a city effectively needs to, or from the perspective of a mayor of a city or an administrator of a city. So if I reframe this in their terms, so what you want is a city that is secure and resilient. You want a city that benefits from fluid and green mobility, a city that has an enjoyable environment that is locally attractive, both from a lifestyle perspective as well as from a job creation perspective, and which creates all of this in a very affordable fashion. So I think Singapore is one of the most advanced places which actually exemplify and which personalize this aspiration. And that's why it's a huge honor for me to be in front of you over here, because it's the obvious benchmark for several cities around the world. So if you look at it from all these angles, in what makes a city a desirable city. Now, different cities brand themselves in different ways. So Singapore may have one way of branding itself, but then some cities refer to their penchant for sustainability. Some cities like to speak about their inclusiveness. So the way they create opportunities for education, healthcare, job creation across all population strata. Some cities refer to themselves in terms of attractive cities or happy cities. Others may refer to their business potential, so being efficient and productive, and so on and so forth. Now, it's not one or the other. Typically, cities combine these different aspects, and therefore, when we start analyzing a city, we analyze each city from all these aspects at two levels. So you see the concentric circles there. The circle on the inside reflects the readiness of the infrastructure of a city. So how good is this infrastructure, be it for energy or for mobility and so on. And the outer layer reflects the level of the efficiency with which this infrastructure is managed. So how efficient are the services that you deliver to maintain and manage this infrastructure? And normally when we begin engaging a city, we try and assess the city together with our city partners on both these levels, on the level of infrastructure and on the level of services. So for instance, in this hypothetical case, once we have done the assessments, then we identify the key gaps in the city, and then based on the city, a city establishes its needs as priorities, and therefore in line with the city's ambitions, we identify which are the gaps that the city needs to prioritize. So you see several white spaces on this hypothetical map. And then there are some spaces which have a border that is bolded there. So these are the areas which, for example, would reflect the city's priorities. So then our job is to then identify the projects that match these priorities, and then to see what the city wants to focus on. Now, Engie is not capable of managing all of these different domains. So we look at it really from a city's perspective, even before we think of our own opportunities. So first, it always starts with the city, understanding the main gaps, understanding therefore the projects that can be prioritized, and then assessing what role Engie has to play in partnering with the city. And that's effectively what we want to do. We want to partner with the city. So if I think of Engie's services, now Engie supports the city at three different levels. The first level is that of the infrastructure itself. So I mentioned Engie having businesses in power generation, but then so we run energy plants and energy networks. We run district heating and cooling networks, so over 300 district heating and cooling networks around the world. We build the public lighting infrastructure, and increasingly moving towards more sustainable forms of lighting like LED. And we also put in place security and safety systems. So that's the level of infrastructure. Then the next is the level of services. And in services, Engie provides a lot of energy services, but also in building management, in green mobility, and so on. The final layer is that of the digital solutions. And for Engie, digital isn't a goal in itself, but digital is a means of making sure that the capex that you invest in your infrastructure is optimized. And the services that are delivered in the city are also delivered in the most efficient fashion. So digital or what goes towards making a city smart is not just a catchphrase. It has a real intent, which is to serve the infrastructure and the services of the city. So I could talk about it, but instead of talking, I'd rather show you some use cases which can really which can give you a better flavor of how these digital solutions are put to the service of the city. So before I start with a short video, so a quick recap of Engie's activities in cities. So we have 5,000 plus charging stations for electric and LNG vehicles. We help reduce cities' average energy consumption by over 30%, so with our energy efficiency business. We manage over 1 million lighting points in different cities across the world. We manage 55 transport networks, which are equipped with our systems. We have over 20,000 megawatts of renewables, and that number is growing over time. And as I mentioned, we have over 200 district cooling and heating networks operated across 13 countries. We have recently won a $1 billion plus deal for managing the district heating and cooling networks in Ohio State University, which is one of the biggest campuses in the world, with over 100,000 people. So it's effectively like a small city, 60,000 students, 40,000 staff, and a lot more, and so on. So the list goes on. And we do this over 70 countries in the world. So Engie already has a global presence, and what I would like to do now is to take you through a short video. So this is a specific city on the Swiss border in France called Mulhouse. So you can see that in the outer rim of the city, so you've got the basic blocks. However, in the center of a city, you want to model with a lot higher granularity. So now you start seeing actual roofs and materials and texture at a level of granularity of up to 1 to 5 centimeters. So this is essential for certain use cases. So once you have this information, then you can begin modeling different aspects of the city. So for instance, in the city, you can model the noise pollution hour by hour, day by day, by having sensors spread all over the city. And once you have this noise pollution monitored, you can track it either at the level of the city or at the level of specific neighborhoods. Once you have these models, then you can also track what are the main causal factors behind the noise, and then put in solutions to manage this noise. So solutions may either be CapEx or OpEx. So similarly for air pollution, for instance, you can see that the bulk of the air pollution over here is caused not by industrial activity in this specific case, but by traffic congestion. And so it's a result of cars operating in first or second gear. And what you want to do is make the traffic more fluid, operate in third and fourth gear for a greater percentage of the time, which means you can put in a CapEx solution like an intelligent traffic management system, or put an OpEx solution like just having more cops on the street to divert the traffic. And so you can, once you have this, you can then simulate what the impact of your solutions will be and show the improvement that you can have as a result of these solutions. So this is an example of energy losses from the facades of the buildings. Now, because you know the materials that are used on the buildings, stone, brick, and so on, you can really map the coefficient of thermal losses and get that information. For Paris, there's a slightly different view. So it's a regular street map, street view, but on top of that, there is a layer of data that you see. So now once you have this layer of data, imagine you are a real estate developer. Now you want to track what is the actual experience of living in any of the apartments at different heights in different locations. And there you can map the incidence of electromagnetic radiation, the noise pollution, the air quality, the blue sky that you can see from any given flat. So it can really model the experience that you have of life in each apartment, which is highly valuable for real estate developers. You can track the wind speeds at different heights as well. Another example is that in Senegal, and here we did an extensive modeling of Dakar, the capital. And here this is an example of the modeling of connectivity at different points in the city. So what is the level of radio connectivity, and therefore how good is the signal that you will get at different points in the city? Alternatively, you can also look at the solar insolation. So now, because you have all the houses and the buildings modeled with the exact angle of incidence of the sun rays on the roofs, you can calculate with a high precision the number of kilowatt hours that can be generated per day, per month, per year on a seasonal basis all through the city. So imagine if you want to say, I want to map out all the government buildings and put solar panels on the government buildings. How much energy can I generate? Or I have a plan to have solar panels on 30% of all residential roofs. So it helps you model in this way, and it can help you also differentiate this modeling by the different zones in the city. So it can embed that level of intelligence as well. Another example is that of the future train line. So Engie has won the contract to build the railway system to the new airport in Dakar. And here, once you have this information, then you can also use it for multiple cases. For instance, you can use it to model the number of minutes that is taken to reach the closest station from different points in the city. So it helps you map the level of accessibility of the stations. It helps you map the level of connectivity that you enjoy at different stations as well. And so it can get a nice variegated view of the city. I mentioned Ohio State University, and here Engie has a 50-year deal. That's 50. A 50-year deal starting with the district heating and cooling networks in the city. So what we want to do is, so what I'm showing you is not just a simulated map. It's a map that is sitting with a lot of analytical data behind it, which is then used to model the evolution of the campus over a period of time. So in red, you have the district heating network. In blue, you have the district cooling network. You can also see visually the level of luminosity of the street lighting and what happens when the regular lights are replaced by LED lights. So we can show visually the impact of having energy efficient lights and you can model the energy consumption at different points in the campus. Similarly, we can do the modeling for the impact of introducing electric vehicles as well as CNG-based vehicles in the campus. So effectively, you are modeling the different drivers of electricity consumption, including, for instance, the growth of foliage over the campus. So the amount of foliage has an impact on the heat island effect, which has an impact on the peak energy consumption. So we can model in different ways. This is a very interesting piece of modeling for the city of San Jose in California. And there, so this is for a client who's keen on introducing autonomous or driverless vehicles in the whole city of San Jose. But this requires a 5G level of connectivity because you want a very strong network with high bandwidth, low latency. And to model at a 5G level, so you want to make sure that every cubic centimeter of air in each of the streets of the city is capable of having a 5G level of connectivity. And that requires a high level of precision in terms of modeling the facades of the buildings, in terms of modeling the foliage, in terms of modeling any item of street furniture at the level of granularity of up to 1 centimeter. So it's a much more sophisticated camera than the one used in Google Street View because it captures a lot more information. In Rio, we have multiple businesses, so we manage, for instance, the public lighting. And there, once you have these public lights, and the street lights, you can have sensors on these street lights which can compile a lot more information, and this can be aggregated. So every street lamp also acts as a source of further information. Along with street lamps, you can also have the entire security system. So Engie has a whole range of CCTV cameras spread all over the city of Rio. And each CCTV camera is mapped out in a way that you can maximize the reach of the cameras while minimizing the capex spend. So the ingress of these cameras is optimized. And with the cameras, you can track two things. You can track both the level of security as well as the vehicular congestion. So what we have in our control centers is it's double view. It's a view of the real-time view of the traffic that can be overlaid on the model of on the 3D model of the city, and it can help you capture the incidence of traffic, and it can then also help you then model or simulate the evolution in traffic once you put your traffic management solutions in place. So we capture all sorts of information on criminality, on traffic congestion, and so on. And when we engage with the city, it helps us design outcome-based contracts, which is we can help you reduce criminality by X%. We can help you manage traffic congestion by X%. We can help improve air quality by Y%. We can help you, and so on. So this really paves the way towards a more intelligent management of a city and towards outcome-based contracts in a city. And that's something that Mark, my colleague, will speak about in his talk as well. So yet another example is that of the planning of buildings. And you can see the whole plan of which buildings will be built, which ones will be demolished, which ones will be adapted. And you can track that information and the impact it has on energy efficiency, on the energy consumption in the city. And the same for electric vehicles as well. So that's an overall view of all of our services. So thank you very much.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the way the UK is structured, because it is structured differently to that of Singapore, and then therefore sets a bit of context. But talk a little bit about how the outsourcing model in the UK has evolved, and it's evolved probably into a more mature state than certainly most parts of Europe and other parts of the world. So it's certainly something that is quite interesting to a lot of places, not just yourselves here in Singapore. And I'm also going to spend a bit of time talking about our actual experiences from an Engie perspective, and share with you some of the contracts that we're running and some of the scope of services, just to give you a feeling of the art of the possible. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about how you might apply it in Singapore, because there are some fundamental differences between the way that we do it in the UK and the way that you manage your local services here in Singapore. And quite clearly, to adopt this model would need some change, and as ever, that change takes time. So just to move on, so just a very quick run through the way the UK is structured. So in the UK, very much like yourselves, we have elected officials. I think the main difference between the UK and Singapore is in the UK, the way the UK local government is structured, it allows for cross-party representation in the council. My understanding of Singapore is that when you have an election, your town council, all of the councillors come from one party, whatever that party may be. Where in the UK, it's possible to have a mix, and very much like our central government, one party can have the majority in Parliament and therefore have almost total control over the council, or it may be the largest party but not have an overall majority and therefore needs the support of other political parties. So I think that's a fundamental difference. I think the other bit that's quite fundamentally different is the if you look on the right-hand side here. In the UK, you have a number of permanently employed officials, what we call council officers in the UK. So these people actually work for the council, irrespective of which party is in power. So when you have an election, these people don't get replaced. And they're structured very much like a private company, in as much as you have a chief executive officer who would ostensibly report to the leader of the council. But that chief executive officer, whose job will be to run the council or the services of the council very much like a business. And then that individual will have a board of directors that will be responsible for a range of services. And below those, there will be a number of what we would call council officers, people that would execute the works. And then below that, you'd have either directly employed people delivering services, or you would have some form of outsourcing. And in terms of the cycle of change, so we're in Singapore. You have, as I understand it, a 5-yearly cycle. Albeit that from the conversation we had yesterday, it appears that sometimes councils will go will go in the 4th year, but you typically have a 5-year cycle. In the UK, it's a 4-year cycle, but every 2 years, half of the elected officials are up for re-election. So every 2 years, the local government gets into a cycle of 50% of the council officers are either voted in or voted out, depending on the mood of the people that live in that area. So I just want to talk a little bit about the decision-making process. So when you've got that 2-tiered structure, ideas or policies come from three routes in the UK. That either come from the elected officials who, have decided that it's something they'd like to do, or they've seen another council do that, or they've seen another part of the world do that. Council officers, so quite often you'll find that the council officers who are permanently employed might go to the politicians and say, I have a thought, I have a suggestion how we could structure our services. And quite clearly, while the council officers can't make that decision, what they can do is bring the thought process to the attention of the elected officials. And then the third bit is something that central government actually insists that a local council will do, and that might be around raising of the amount that the councils can raise council taxes, which I think is a similar thing to your service charge. And to be fair, central government interference in local government is pretty remote, so it doesn't happen very often. So the main two decision-making areas are elected officials and the council officers. So let's assume that they've come up with a proposal, and once the sort of the ideas come about, then it's the job of the council officers to actually draw that up in detail. They would then bring that back to the council for political approval, and depending on how big a decision it is, it might well be made by the cabinet. Or it might well be made by the full council. So in the UK, local government will create a cabinet of some 10 or 15 councillors who will have the majority of the decision making. But if it's a big decision, it will go to full council, which means that you've got cross-party representation. And that would be something that would be enshrined in the constitution of each of the councils. And then another cross check and balance that the UK has is they have things called scrutiny committees. So quite clearly, even when a council has made a decision, irrespective of who made that decision, even if it's the leader of the council, it is the subject and can be the subject of calling by the scrutiny committee for a review, and that is represented by a cross-party political process. So the idea of that is a check and a balance to make sure that nothing too radical goes through without full approval. And assuming that that's the case, then the project in the UK, certainly for the time that the UK remains in Europe, post-Brexit, who's to know what we do? But currently, any local government or central government contract that's going to be procured has to go into what we call the OG, which is the Official Journal of the European Union. So that means that any organisation anywhere in Europe can apply to participate in that procurement process. I think the reality of life is in the UK, the majority of it is UK companies. In France, the majority would be French companies. In Holland, the majority would be Dutch companies. But it is a level playing field if people want to throw their hat in the ring, so to speak. And then having gone through the procurement process, the implementation of whatever project or policy that the council's agreed on will be actually the responsibility of the council officers. So the politicians will monitor it, but it's the council officers that will deliver that. So if you look at the UK outsourcing model, and this is something that we started to talk a bit about yesterday at a previous seminar, was that so the UK's been outsourcing for 30 to 40 years now, and if you look around the 1980s, it was a very simple single outsourcing, soft FM, very very easy, low level, one dimension outsourcing, and then you came into the 1990s and it became a bit more complex in terms of we started to bring asset management into the play, we started to bring more complex contract management models in, and then when we got into the early 2000s, for the first time ever we came up with the model called, the acronym's PFI, which stands for Private Finance Initiative. So the first time ever the UK actually said, or the UK government, central government said, we've got aged assets across the whole of the UK, whether it be schools, hospitals, highways, any other form of public buildings, and this was their way of levering out private investment into public sector owned buildings, and that evolved a whole new sort of generation of more complex outsourcing decisions. And then if you take us through to sort of 2010, then you started to see more complex deals, and where we are today, you're looking at workplace change management, sustainable workspace, and management of intelligent buildings. So if you come back to Amit's presentation around the buildings, what you're starting to see is that it's not just I'm outsourcing a service, it's you clean my building or you maintain my building. You're into actually how do you transform the management of that building while you're maintaining it. So we look at the trends, and we won't spend too much on this, but if you look at the trends, if you see in the top right-hand corner here, this shows you the sort of trend of the number of organisations that were looking to outsource and the type of outsourcing they were looking to between 2014 and 2016. So I think in the context of the town councils within the UK, but also here in Singapore, you can quite clearly see on the Estates FM piece that there's a significant jump in the intent to outsource that type of service. I think the other interesting thing on this slide is if you look at finance and human resources and procurement, there was a significant leap, particularly in finance, around outsourcing that. And certainly when we get on a little bit later, we can talk a bit about one of the projects that we're doing, which actually involves. And that's what we call in the UK BPO, which is business process outsourcing. And that's quite a significant step forward from where Singapore currently is. But that's the sort of route the UK's taken. Then I think if you look at the left-hand diagram, it shows a split between the type of deals that have been outsourced. So the blue represents single service, so that would be one service you've outsourced. And if you look at it, it's been pretty consistent over the last 5 or 6 years. But the interesting thing is that the difference between the green and the orange bars. So the green bar represents what we call bundle services. So these would be services that would be outsourced to one service provider, which would actually not necessarily be related, but be a range of services. It might be estates maintenance, it might be highways maintenance, it might be management of parks. And then the orange one's about integrated services. This is where we're starting to look at, well if we outsource a number of services that are integrated, then that starts to bring into play a far more integrated approach from a service provider's perspective, which starts to create efficiencies, cost savings, and transformational change, which is one of the things that drives the UK market at the moment. So this is one of the slides I'm not going to spend too much time on, but if you look at that, you can see market drivers. So again, there's a whole range of complex market drivers that actually start to inform the decision in the UK now. And again, this will be available. So and I'm more than happy to take questions on it. But you can see at a glance that we're into quite a complex range of services that drive those decisions. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on these. But again, if you take it the context of the UK. You can see that austerities, you may or may not be aware, is a big political driver in the UK. And just one soundbite there is between 2010 and 2016, local authorities' funding from central government will actually fall by over 35% in real terms. And that means the local authorities have to find some means of replacing that funding or some means of delivering the same level of service for 35% less. And then you can go through older population, which I know is a worldwide challenge for everybody. A growing population in the UK. Diverse population. The UK is very ethnically diverse and continues to be so, hence the current debate around Brexit and immigration, etc. Environmental issues, that's a worldwide pressure that we've all got. And technology is starting to take a pace, so automating people's access to services and support functions. And again, devolution. Again, what we're seeing in the UK is adjoining authorities actually joining up together to deliver a certain range of services. And again, that's something that within the the 12 or 16 town councils you've got in Singapore is something that's worth some thought. And then we talk about care of the elderly, economic growth, the drivers for growth. And service models and mobility. So I'll move on from that. So I think this is the bit I wanted to spend a little bit of time. So what drives a council in the UK to make that decision about outsourcing? So if you turn the clock back to the early days, it was about cost reduction. It was about actually, can I deliver the same service for less money? Then I think as it's evolved, it's become, well, okay, let's look at the quality element of that. So, am I going to get more quality for the same amount of money? I.e., if I pay someone the same amount of money, am I going to get more services, which actually then means I have a more positive impact on, the people that pay the taxes locally in the councils. And then we moved into sustainability. And I think there are two elements to sustainability. It's the obvious one around, the green carbon reduction and green environment. But I think the other things about sustainability is about actually longevity of assets. So again, in the UK, we started to think around, buying a lamp that costs you $10, which will last, which has a burn life of 3 years, as opposed to buying a lamp that costs $14 that gives you a burn life of, 10 to 15 years. And the LED revolution is one of those typical examples of cost against sort of life. So that started to become very much part of the sustainability calculation. And carbon reduction, as we all know, is a major challenge for the whole of the world. And then the need to transform. So I think as you saw that reduction in funding from central government, the need for councils to transform their services to find more cost-effective ways, more efficient ways to deliver the services, and also to transform the services they deliver. And so as our population is ageing, how we provide welfare facilities, etc. So what's the main feature of a UK outsourcing model? So the bundle services, so putting a range of services into it rather than just outsourcing one particular delivery model. A number of advantages for a council on that one. The council can adopt what we call a thin client, which means that its management team doesn't have to be particularly big, because it's effectively bundling a whole range of services and asking its service providers to deliver those. So it has one single point of contact for the delivery of all those and managing the contract. Coordinate all your help desks, so the range of services go to one number. Quite clearly, that help desk team need to be well trained, but you can reduce numbers and people and create some cost effectiveness there. Reducing FM management and cost, again, typically in local government in the UK, traditionally you would have almost a siloed mentality of different managers would manage different streams of delivery, bringing all that under one umbrella and having one point of contact. Multi-skilling, again, starting from a service provider's perspective to actually look at the resources it's deploying and making sure that they're trained in to do more than one job, such as that you start to create a far more responsive service, B, make it more flexible, both from a geographical perspective and also in terms of being able to turn people out when you need to. And also reducing client procurement costs. So what you quite often see in the UK is that notwithstanding the range of services that they outsource to a service provider, they also ask the service provider to do all of the procurement on their behalf. We would typically call that what we call managed budgets, where we're actually buying all sorts of things for the council, so they can actually strip out all of their cost around procurement and make it the responsibility of the service provider. One of the big challenges, I think, from a Singaporean perspective is to get the best out of this model. Your term contract needs to be some more than the 5-year election cycle that you currently have, So typically in the UK, it's 10 plus years. Typically in the UK, it's 10 with an option to extend for a further 5. One of the debates and questions that we've had is around, how does this change in administration deal with that? The contract terms and commercial terms need to reflect that. But what that does is it allows a service provider to bring investment in assets and technology. So a service provider has a 10-year cycle with which to sort of recover its money. And so therefore, you're likely to see far more investment and far more innovation and innovative thoughts and suggestions and proposals come forward under a 10-year deal than you would under a 5. More investment in people, again, in the UK, and I can't speak for the labour market in Singapore, but in the UK, guaranteeing someone 10 years' work is pretty appealing in the UK these days. So again, if you've got a 10-year deal, you're more likely to keep your staff. You're more likely to be able to invest in training of new apprentices, graduates. So you're not only ensuring the longevity and delivery of the services, you're also creating employment within the local area. And it also improves staff retention in the UK. If you've got a 5-year deal, when you get into year 4, a lot of your staff are starting to think about where their next job's coming from, and you do tend to see you get a bit of what we call churn rate. We start to lose people in the back end of a contract. So again, and that has an impact on the services. Someone that's been doing the job and knows the job leaves you 4 years into a 5-year deal. For that last year, you've got to go and find resources to deliver that. The other big piece, and I'll talk a little bit as the next slide, is about we move from what we call an input-based contract to an output or an outcome-based one, and I'll talk a little bit about the next slide. And the other bit is risk transfer. So within all of this, one of the things that councils can do is actually move the risk. So a typical one that I think in terms of the Singapore model is you can move the risk of cost of materials to your service provider. Currently, the way it's currently managed in Singapore, as I understand it, you typically appoint a managing agent, and the managing agent manages the business on your behalf. But the cost is the cost, and the council takes that cost. In this sort of model, you can actually tie a service provider into a guaranteed income stream, irrespective. And the classic one I always use is lighting in an estate. If 1 month 10 lights pop, you change them. Next month 20 lights pop. you're paying twice the amount to have your lights changed. In this sort of deal, the service provider would take that risk. So there's some real benefits about certainty there. So, and apologies if those of you that know this, so I don't want to be teaching my granny to suck heads, so to speak. But so the difference between input and output spec, and the most simple one I could think of was lights again. So in an input spec type approach, you typically would say to your managing agent or your subcontractor, well, you need to inspect the lights once a month, and if there are any lights are not on, then you need to change them. So you're actually prescribing when they do it and what they do when they do that. An output spec changes to saying, well, it's your responsibility to make sure that 100% of the lights are in light 95% of the time. And then quite clearly, it then becomes a service provider responsibility to make sure that they meet that. And then what you would have around that would be what we call a KPI, a key performance indicator, which would actually, in the event that we fail to deliver that as a service provider, then there's a financial penalty. And I think the other thing in the UK, we've moved to what we call outcome specifications. So this is actually what's the outcome of your efforts. And the two examples here are off of a job that I was managing for a while called North East Lincolnshire Regeneration Partnership. So one of the outcomes there is we're measured by the amount of new jobs that we create in the area. So we have economic regeneration and inward investment responsibility, which we're measured by. But actually, a direct result of that will be is that we create jobs. So the outcome is that we create jobs. If we don't create jobs, then we pay a penalty. Another one is about reduction in serious road traffic accidents. So we have the responsibility in that contract for not only managing the highways, but also the highway design, and highway safety. And one of the outcomes is if we do that properly, then we will reduce the amount of serious road traffic accidents. And again, if we don't, we face a financial penalty. So the benefits for the council in this model. First and foremost, it's to provide, value for money for the citizens of the council area. Your councillors represent, as councillors represent the people within their council boundary, and everything that they do should be destined and driven to create value. It has to be structured to meet the aims of the council, so every council that comes in has an objective, has a thought, and that will change over time, but at the point of time of doing it, you need to think about the structure, what are the aims, and therefore your deal needs to reflect that. It needs to be accountable, measured. Quite clearly you're handing over an awful lot of responsibility to somebody else to manage those services on your behalf. So you've got to have a means of making them accountable, you've got to be a means of measuring them against specific service standards, and you've got to be happy that those are accurate. You're looking for a flexible and responsive service, so quite clearly, part of the bundle services attraction is that the service provider will structure itself to be very responsive to whatever happens, and also the unforeseen circumstances. So in the UK, as an example, we've been quite prone to flooding over the last, over the last 5 to 10 years. Our weather patterns are changing, and certainly when I was at North East Lincolnshire Council. We had a very high tide one and half of the town was flooded, and we had to respond to that. That wasn't something we planned for. The other thing is it releases strategic capacity within the council. So quite often councils have got people that are capable of doing far more than they're doing, but they're actually tied down managing pretty basic services on occasion that could quite easily be outsourced. So it releases that thinking power, that capacity to do other things that the council might want to do. It also, getting back to Amit's presentation, it taps into the resources of a larger organisation. So you start off with a range of services, but that organisation then sort of starts to say, well, actually, we could take this on, we could take that on, and that actually might be the benefit of the council. And that leads us into innovation and continuous improvement. Quite often in a UK outsourcing deal, the requirement to find innovation and continuous improvement is a measure, and therefore it's not just a bit of a few token words in the bid. It's an absolute requirement that they deliver that. Investment options, we've touched on that already. It allows us to invest and also transfer of risk. So the drawbacks. So quite clearly, this sounds all very good. So why wouldn't you all be doing it? So there has to be some drawbacks, doesn't there? And I think one of the real major obstacles is the cost of delivering one of these deals. In the UK, typically it might take as much as 2 years to deliver a deal like this. So there's a cost that has to be accounted for, and a council has to be happy that it will recover the cost of procuring the deal in whatever savings that it sees over a 5 or a 10 year period. Resource and capacity, again, you know, we're entering into a quite a complex commercial world, and quite clearly within that, not all councils have got the resource in terms of legal, commercial, technical to do the deal. So there has to be a view about how they deliver that, whether they engage external consultants, but there's a cost associated with that. Long-term commitment, you know, councils are making commitment on handing their services over to a third party for a period of time. And again, we come back to the Singapore model. I think that's one of the challenges that we need to think about. And there's a loss of control. There's a piece about, well, actually, I'm handing this over and I'm not going to have control for it for 10 years. You know, how do I feel about that? I'm going to skip over this one, mindful of time. So things that a council needs to consider. So I think a really important one is how does it feel culturally? So quite clearly, you know, there's a political element. You know, does it meet the politics of the council that are leading the council at that point in time? And again, if you take the UK, that would also be subject to decision and discussion with all the parties. Ideologically, does it fit? So again, you know, certain councils in the UK might have a real aversion to outsourcing their welfare care as an example. So quite clearly, you know, the structure of the deal has got to be something that suits the council. Can the council afford to complete the transaction? You know, as I said, it's a 12 to 24 month period. Resources, we talked about that. Does the council have the resource, or if it doesn't, where will it get it from? Is the council happy that it's got the appropriate service level measures in place? And how's it going to measure this deal? How's it going to make sure that, having bought the deal, that actually the service provider is going to deliver what it's undertaken to deliver? And this, I think, is a really important piece, flexibility. So we've had lots of debates about, well, you know, when you get to a change in an administration cycle, what happens? The deal has to be flexible enough that actually, you know, you can amend it and change it to suit the needs. So over a 10-year period, the council's objectives will change. You know, the political nature of the council is likely to change. So it needs to be flexible. And is the transfer of risk appropriate? So, you know, are you shedding enough of the risk that you carry currently to the service provider to make it worthwhile? When the council makes a decision on who it's going to go with, you know, when it looks at its service providers, the 2 or 3 or 4 that bid for it, you know, do they have the resources and commitment to invest? Can they deliver those service enhancements? You know, does the service provider have critical mass and a proven track record? Have they done this before? Can they actually demonstrate they've done it? And do you think they're going to show flexibility and collaboration? And I know that's a bit of a leap of faith, but it's a really, really important part. You know, there needs to be trust between the two parties to make this work. I'm not going to talk too much about this slide because it's quite a complex one, but I think the point I'd make is if you look sort of the 3rd and 4th level down, negotiated and competitive dialogue, they're both forms of procurement that are typical in an outsourcing deal, and the reason they're typically used is because they allow, the structure of them allows both parties to have a open conversation around the technicalities of it. So quite clearly, you know, the complexity of these deals brings in some fairly detailed technical thoughts, both in terms of the technical delivery and also the commercial arrangements around that. And in the UK, the negotiated and competitive dialogue are the 2 that are most frequently used for this type of procurement. As a matter of interest, the framework agreement piece, which is the last one on there, is something that's very typically used in central government. So you go through all that hard negotiation up front, then you become a framework contractor, which means that it shortens the procurement process for central government that might be procuring, you know, numbers of these services. You know, a local council is only going to procure something like this once or twice in a 10 to 15 year life cycle, I would have thought. So just to flick through, and I think rather than, I'll flick over that slide just to sort of give you a flavour of some of the, so North East Lincolnshire is a regeneration partnership that we have with so North East Lincolnshire is a council on the east coast of England. It was a 10 plus 5 year deal initially. It's currently a 12 plus 3. We've had a 2-year extension as part of some of the work that we did there. It deals with sort of 4 main areas of delivery: facilities and asset management. So that's not only the management of the facilities, but also the strategic asset management of the council. So one of our output requirements on that contract was to actually get rid of the council's The council had 27 offices and they wanted to actually merge into 4. So we went through a process of logistics of refurbishing the offices, moving people around, and then actually disposing of the vacant properties. Highways and transport, we touched on a bit earlier on. We've got responsibility for not only for maintenance of the highways, but also the design. As an example, we built a kilometre long road to bypass one of the towns in the region. Economic and physical regeneration and planning. This is about inward investments. This brings me back to my point earlier around creation of jobs. And then the other interesting point for us was we had a number of architects that came across to us. So up there we typically design and project manage the building of public sector buildings such as local primary schools, libraries, leisure centres and that sort of thing. So just to give you a flavour of what the architects have done, there's a picture. There's the one on the top right hand is an office block. So that used to be a council-owned car park, and there was a legal firm locally that gave an undertaking to take that building for 15 years, and the council funded the building of that office block, and we designed it and project managed the build of it. On the left-hand corner, that's a brand new leisure centre that we designed and built within the region, which is structured to be at competitive standards. So that gives you a flavour of some of the things. North Tyneside, so this is our first what we call BPO, business process outsourcing. So at North Tyneside, we don't deliver any frontline services in as much as FM or any sort of asset or highways. We manage their back office, we manage their finance, we manage their IT. We also deal with the revenue collection. So the service charge that you typically see in Singapore, we call council tax in the UK. So we're responsible for collecting the council tax for the council. We're also responsible for managing the revenues and benefits office. So for people that are, at the low end of the scale that actually get benefits from the state, we pay the benefits out. And so we took a number of commitments around that. Cheshire West and Chester is a joint venture. So this is in the UK. There was what they call an LABV, which is an asset-backed vehicle, which allows councils to become a business. So we're in joint venture with the council here. So what it allows us to do is actually sell the services that the council deliver to third parties, which typically is something that legally the councils are not allowed to do in the UK. Wakefield's our latest one, and I think the interesting one with that is the first time that we've had the sale of energy as a fundamental part of it. So, coming back to Amit's point around how you can lever services in, that wasn't really originally in the deal, but as we negotiate the deal through, the inclusion of energy services became a fundamental part of the contract. So, just mindful of time. So, coming to Singapore. So I think, quite clearly, the UK model is completely different to Singapore. It has been a 30 to 40 years journey. I've got the 5 minutes. Thank you. And so I think that so some questions that I sort of challenged with when we did the slot yesterday, and things to consider is so from a Singaporean perspective, how do you deal with the change or the potential of a change of a ministry at each 5-yearly election? I think that's something of great concern, locally, in as much as well. If you get a complete change in administration, how do they deal with the fact that the previous administration is committing them something to that politically they're not particularly keen on? So I think that's a big hurdle to be discussed and debated. Boundary shifters, again, as I understand it, so in the UK the boundaries are pretty static. I understand here that one election to the other, depending on the mix of your councillors that have been elected, you do on occasion see boundary shift. So quite clearly that might actually introduce the fact that you bring assets in or you take assets out of what was previously the deal. Scope of responsibilities, so quite clearly the split in Singapore between what the town councils manage and what the statutory bodies manage is different to the UK. Quite clearly a lot of what sits within local government's remit in the UK is currently under the control of the statutory bodies. So is there a possible link between the town councils and the statutory bodies, which I fully acknowledge would bring all sorts of political debate into play, but certainly something to be considered, because by doing that you can create a far more bundled deal and greater economy of scale. The resource to bid that, this is a new thing, and if you were to do it in Singapore, quite clearly, it would take additional resource to that the councils probably have got currently, I suspect. Now, whether or not there's a bundle piece to sort of get create a team. Typically in the UK, you find certain legal and commercial firms become experts at outsourcing and tend to sort of move from one council to another. That's maybe something to consider. And can you create economies of scale with joining up neighbouring town councils? Again, might be very sensitive. I suspect probably will. But and to be fair, 20 years ago it was very sensitive in the UK. But necessity has driven us to do that. So just final slide, opportunities. So I think the opportunities are enhancement of service levels, getting more than you currently are able to afford or deliver in the time that you're there. You get structured improvement plans with milestones. So again, you get your service provider commit to giving you specific deliverables over a period of time. It gives you a mechanism to drive transformational change, which you probably don't have the opportunity to consider within your 5-yearly cycle currently. It creates economy of scale, means you can either buy the same service for less or buy more services for the same price. And it means that, in a long-term deal, that a big service provider will come in and will be prepared to invest in assets locally. So I'm just going to leave you with two quotes, if I may. So this one from Bill Gates. So Bill Gates said, "We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. Don't let yourself be lulled into inaction, not loved into inaction." And then the other one is from the Director General of the Facilities Management Association in the UK, who said, "The market leaders are able to provide the client efficiency gains above mere outsourcing. Innovation is becoming key, but that requires scale." Thank you very much for listening.
My question, actually, taking away from town councils, is more to you, Amit. I suppose it's sort of opposite you're talking today, given what happened in America with the President Trump pulling the US out of the Paris climate change. I just wonder, with the sorts of things you show that your company's leading and the sorts of energy innovations that are happening around the world, whether it is in fact as significant as maybe people might have thought, that the US is pulling itself out, and I just appreciate your views on that.
In terms of what Mr. Trump has said, well, we evidently don't agree with his stance. Now, on a substantive basis, my personal view is that I don't think it'll amount to much because there are several economic trends in all of the technologies that he's speaking about, which really override any political decisions. For instance, when you speak of coal, now coal is becoming increasingly uneconomical when compared to renewable technologies, including solar. Plus, in addition to the economics of coal, there's also the aspect of the water intensivity of several of the thermal generation choices. So they are heavily water intensive for cooling purposes, and therefore, if you're looking at places like India or China, then the big challenge in coming years is going to be water. So therefore, from that perspective as well, it's not just the carbon footprint, but also the water footprint that we need to be cognizant of in order to determine our energy choices going in the future. And that's also where renewables heavily score over thermal technologies, including nuclear. When it comes, I think the challenge, so therefore, is not so much related to the policies around climate change and so on, because the rest of the world is pretty united, and it has a fundamental underpinning to that question. The challenge will be in terms of the level of trust that is needed in order to manage several of the decisions across a whole host of other issues. I mean, we've got several geopolitical issues that we are confronted with. Climate change is one of them, but there's also terrorism. There's also just plain economics and business opportunities. There's the aspect of migration. There's several different aspects that governments have to collaborate on, have to cooperate on, and the underpinning to that is that of trust. So if you are engaging in a way where you see it fit to renege on political agreements that have been framed with a lot of negotiation, with decades of negotiation, and then when you see let's say Angela Merkel, for instance, make a statement that well, the U.S. position cannot any longer be trusted. I think that for me is one of the biggest collateral damages coming from Trump's stand.
Mark, just now you have shared a long-term contract which adopted in UK. Now, in our local context, many of our contracts are mostly on a short-term basis, 2 or 3 years. I think there are a lot of advantages for long-term contracts, but just wonder how do you address some of the concerns in a long-term contract? For example, you may not be able, or rather the vendor may not be able to foresee the changes in the next 10 years. And if they were to commit and price it, should the situation change or circumstances change, it's either the vendor may not be, will be in a positions that they may not be able to cope with whether the cost increase, or on the other hand, the councils may be in a disadvantaged positions. That means it's the difficulties in adjusting to the changes. How do you address this aspect of it? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, that, and it's certainly something that we've discussed, quite a lot over the last 3 or 4 days since I've been here. And I think, I take it back to the flexibility. So if you take the UK model as it currently stands, and certainly our experience, if you go back to North East Lincolnshire as an example, we've been there now for, I think we're in our 6th or 7th year, and we have had situations where the council have pulled some of the services back. They had a change in circumstances. Part of the regeneration part was not working quite as effectively as both parties thought it would. The council took that back in and re-engaged it and reabsorbed it into the council. At the same time, a year or so later, supply of energy is something that we've done with the council. So that's an additional service. So I think the bit that's absolutely critical is making sure that the deal has the ability to be flexed to meet the needs and the changing needs as you go forward. And quite clearly, and this is a very difficult thing to do at the start, but trust. You have to have a partner that when you go to that partner and say, things have changed. The landscape's changed either through micro or macroeconomics, and therefore I need to have a conversation around that. And I think that's the piece where I think the challenge is actually getting the right advice from a council's perspective to make sure that your legal and commercial advice structures a deal that gives you the ability to come back, and also from the service provider's perspective to have that conversation and say, we think that we could do with shaping this deal slightly differently. So I think unlike the sort of contracts that you probably currently let, which are for 3 to 5 years, which are very structured, very rigid, and probably have no change or no accommodation for change, this sort of deal needs to have the ability to flex, because quite clearly life will change, and it will be either a change in the political party, possibly in terms of election time, or a change in what the central government choose to do in terms of how it decides to run Singapore. That can have a knock-on effect, or simple economics. So I think that's the crux. I know it sounds as if it's not a particularly structured response in as much as it is the devil's in the detail, as they always say with a contract. But the major thing is to make sure that you get that flexibility built in. And one of the things that we did discuss is that quite often you can foresee where you can't absolutely know. You can look forward and think, well, actually, there are 4 or 5 things that possibly are on the horizon. And if you've got a little bit of clarity about that, you can actually have those as specifics within the contract that says that should you come to that there's a specific course of action. I think sometimes we all get a bit scared of what might change, but if we look back the ways, we can actually be pretty confident that the change over a 5 to 10 year period, major change that might want you to change a commercial deal, might be no more than 3 or 4 areas that you might want to enshrine as a specific area of attention.
I think it's interesting to see that 2 very different questions have ended up with very similar answers. It comes back to transparency and trust that you want to engage in, and without that, you can't have any kind of a sustainable deal, either at a municipal level or at a large-scale geopolitical level.
Push the point a bit further about this flexibility. I think what we are trying to do here in Singapore, in terms of contracting, is dealing with new concepts such as spiral contracting. I agree with you that requires a lot of trust, because it transfers the risk from the contracting party and so on and so forth. So are there any lessons that you think we can learn from in terms of how to apply some of these concepts? Having a contract where we need not say everything up front, but to have some conditions up front and then let it run for a period of time, and then after a while certain conditions come in and then we take on the contract to the next stage.
I think you could do it 2 ways. I think you could you could structure you could do the deal where you only hand over a range of your services for 2 years, and almost have a almost like a hockey stick approach that says, well, okay, we'll have some checks and balances and some real key deliverables within that first 2 to 3 years, and that gives you the option, very much like the 10. If you take the UK 10+5 approach, they're quite clearly at the 10-year period. If the council's not getting what it wants, it can walk away from the deal, and it's not duty bound to give you the 5-year extension. So maybe one of the things you might look at in a Singaporean sort of model is actually something that has a break that's earlier against a range of services, but obviously with a guarantee that if at that point you've delivered what you expect to be delivered, that you might then migrate to sort of give further services over. So I think that's one way of doing it. I think the other way is agreeing, some really strong termination, and it sounds terrible that we're talking about termination in the context of us trying to sort of convince you to do that, but quite clearly, the councils have to protect themselves from a service provider that where the service goes completely wrong. And I think that's where the strong part of the commercial piece is. Well, okay, what are the checks and balances, and what is the recourse around termination should you choose to do that? And quite clearly, I think the major impact on that would have, from a service provider's perspective, is how much the service provider would be prepared to commit. And that becomes a risk analysis on terms of the service provider. And I think if you go back into the procurement models that I touched on in terms of the negotiated and the competitive dialogue, it's in those forums that those things get explored. So I think that I think the challenge is, or the frightening thing is to think that you've got to come up with those up front, and I don't think that's the case. I think that if you use those two procurement models to their fullest, you can have a very open conversation that together you work out what the technical deliverables are with the commercials around that, and you do that such that both parties, should they get to signing the deal, actually go there with complete eyes open. Does that answer it? Yeah.
It's very interesting, your whole range of work, but there's a specific question I'd like to ask. It's about the trees, because we do have trees that are quite old, but not as old as those in England, I believe. Do you have a Boris who have to look after trees in terms of the maintenance of it, and how often do you do it, so that we can see where to learn from you? A second question is about technology in terms of productivity and to reduce manpower, as well as high technology that we can use, because we are looking at designers coming in to work with the planners and all, so that they can solve some problems before the maintenance come in and you have to solve your problem.
Okay, no, thank you. Well, so the trees is a very interesting one and very emotive in the UK, as you probably very cleverly outlined there. So within the UK, we have a thing called a tree preservation order. So if a tree gets beyond a certain, the council will actually survey all of its trees and place a tree preservation order against those trees that it wants to preserve. The reality of life is that at some point, like all of us, the tree gets to an age where actually it might be, might have been there, 80, 90, 100 years, but it becomes, a danger from a, from a health and safety perspective. Either the roots are undermining someone's property and the property is in danger of falling down, or it's just old. And it would be fair to say that when the council decides to chop those trees down, then people chain themselves to the trees. And all sorts of things, and but in terms of protection, the tree preservation order is the first line of protection, and normally if there is going to be a tree, a tree cull of any description, there'd be an awful lot of consultation. But the reality of life is, with trees that get to a certain age, at some point you have to deal with them, and that's always a very sensitive, as I suspect you've probably experienced in Singapore as well. Yeah. In terms of innovation technology, so if you take the architectural side of things, which you do, talking about, we have, picking on some of the sort of models that Amit was showing, is we do a lot of 3D modelling now, and so there's a lot of upfront modelling that we're doing. The sort of 3D walkthroughs that you can do, and quite clearly. The driver for a new building in the UK, and I suspect that you're probably ahead of the UK here, because going around Singapore I can see how developed it is any sort of new build or a refurbishment of an existing building is very much driven by the need to create sustainable energy, sustainable solutions. So in the UK, one of the things that the business we've just acquired a business that deals with refurbishment social housing, and which is a world away from our origins as being an Engie provider. But the reason that we've done that, it fits within our local government piece about the refurbishment of social housing care, and actually putting innovative equipment in there that actually reduces the amount of energy these properties need to consume. To actually, whereas in Singapore it's about air conditioning, in the UK it's about heating. Very rare that we'd ever even think about air conditioning in place in the UK. For anybody that's worked or lived in the UK, you can probably attest to that. So I think that the whole driver is, and our chief exec in the UK, who is a Suez man, been in GDF Suez for more years than I care to remember. His mantra is around, it's not about selling people energy, it's about selling people energy conservation. And there's a very distinctive difference around the way we approach. So it's probably not asking your question in absolute detail, but everything we do is around how we make something a more sustainable environment, and we're using all of the tools. Another innovation that we've introduced in North Tyneside, in terms of, which is slightly off this, but not to some extent linked, is we've got computer robotics. So a lot of the stuff we're doing now is we're introducing computer robotics that actually take an awful lot of the manual handling of all of that asset data and all of the sort of engineering data, asset management data, highways data, and so we're starting to do that. And whilst I am talking about taking the ability of people to, this computer will do the same job as 3 people. And it is an issue about the fact, are we taking people's jobs away? What we are doing is creating a more efficient service delivery, which means that we can deploy those 3 individuals into something that creates value for the council. Oh, sorry, my apology, productivity. So yeah. My brain can only hold about 2 questions at once, so apologies for that. So productivity is a very interesting one, as much as so in terms of the way we plan the work, so one of the other things that we can do is, and if you bring that back to the bundle services thing, is around ensuring that you plan the work, that we're not crisscrossing, geographically, we're not having people driving, in an 8-hour day they spend 3 hours driving. So there's a big emphasis on work planning. Now, I accept that reactive maintenance doesn't necessarily lend itself to work planning, but again, typically, within the UK outsourcing model, we would have a time period to respond to a reactive maintenance job. Obviously, it's an emergency job, then we're out there within an hour. But again, we employ quite a lot of asset management deployment models to maximise the amount of time that we deploy somebody, rather than having them driving back and forth. And interesting enough, our congestion is far worse than Singapore, believe it or not. I can tell you that from experience. I think the robotics piece is another bit that drives that. So we're releasing people from the day-to-day machinations of doing that, and actually deploying them on more important things. And then the innovation and the investment piece starts to come into that. So it's about buying equipment and upgrading assets with equipment that needs less maintenance, or is more easy to access. We were having a conversation last night about refurbishing properties in and around Singapore, and putting new AC units in, and how you do that, and making sure that it's accessible. So I think all those things go into planning. So I think the real key for us is upfront planning. Never leaping into it without thinking about how we're going to do it, and always revisiting that process and saying, well, how can we improve it? Where can we shave a bit more off, and how can we make it more efficient?
Is Elgin doing something more like more the predictive front, to predict something before it happens? Because I think on our end, for maintenance, this is an area of work where the Singapore government is really looking to see, for instance, how do I prevent the next lift from breaking down, rather than going through this reactive maintenance schedule.
Yeah. I can give you 2 examples of that. The first example, for instance, is using LPWAN networks. So LPWAN is low power wide area networks for predictive maintenance. So one of our research labs called CLC is right now assessing the feasibility of using sensors in our existing power plants. And the sensors are connected with the LPWAN network in order to improve the efficiency of the predictive maintenance of the different equipments in the power plant. So that's one example which can be easily applied to absolutely anything else, not just a power plant, any large industrial installation or even a big residential complex, including equipments and lifts and etc. So everything else. So that's one very obvious example. A second example of using predictive analytics is in the space of security. So for instance, Engie has a big business in security where we provide the physical infrastructure for security like CCTV cameras, but we also then have we also run the command and control centers to manage the output from these cameras. Now, in addition to that, we also have a partnership with IBM, and IBM here bring some of their most advanced analytics, like for instance the Watson supercomputer, and there this is deployed in terms of recognizing patterns of activity in different contexts. So let's say you are at a big football match, and there is a chance of riots emerging from that match. So what IBM does is we have Engie provides the usual cameras. These cameras capture a lot of information. IBM's job is to capture then the patterns, and once these patterns are identified, so it's put through these machine learning models, which basically learn how to identify the relevant patterns as you go along, and then once these patterns are identified, then Engie can effectively make a human call on which of these patterns that you're seeing are likely to result in an incident that requires prevention. So, so it's a wonderful example of a combination of machine learning coupled with human intelligence, and this is how a bunch of distributed assets together with on the right level of analytics can support predictive decision making. You can, if I extend that a bit more widely, so let's say when you have different assets spread all over a city, the assets may be your CCTV cameras, the assets may be your public lighting, the assets may be your district heating and cooling networks. So regardless of what it is, the assets allow you an added layer of information by attaching sensors and devices to them. So once you have these sensors and devices all over the city, then you can start making more intelligent decisions by creating further use cases for how to manage your city in a more efficient fashion. So for instance, when you have information coming from your waste bins that, okay, it's over 80% used, so why don't you go and empty it? Rather than, so it's more intelligent decision making at a city level, at a municipal level, to make sure that you are managing your processes in a more efficient fashion. Or in several countries, you see the instance of the electric utility coming one day to dig up your roads. Then the next week, the telephone utility comes in and digs the same roads. And the next week, it's the water utility, and so on. So you find several municipal departments operating in silos. But now, if you have the right level of information flowing at a geolocational level, you can then plan more intelligently and therefore predict or avoid the kinds of issues that happen every day in siloed environments.